Order. I'd like to call the Standing Committee on Public Accounts to order. My name is Gordon Wilson. I'm filling in for Alan McMaster as chair today. And just to start off, I just wanted to remind everybody in attendance to please put their phones on silent or vibrate. And we'll start our meeting here. I'd first like to start by asking the committee members to introduce themselves, starting with Ms. Roberts.
Lisa Roberts, MLA for Halifax Needham.
Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville Cobequid.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Good morning, Suzanne, Lowness, Croft, MLA, Luneberg.
Hi everyone, Ben Jess, I'm here, Hammonds Plains, Lucasville.
Good morning, Bill Horne, Waverly Fall River Beaver Bank, filling in for Brendan Mcguire.
Good morning, Humic, Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you very much. So on today's agenda, we have the Office of the Auditor General with respect to the October 2017 financial report. I'd like to also just make a couple brief comments. First off, I want to thank the Auditor General this morning for hosting us to breakfast and let everybody in the world know that he makes excellent date squares, which we all enjoyed. And it was a very, very good conversation. Thank you. And also, I think on behalf of everybody here, we are pleased, which I'm sure we'll hear in your comments about the timeliness of getting this report out to us, which I think is extremely important in light of how we manage ourselves as government. So thank you very much on that. So I'd ask the witnesses to introduce themselves, starting with Mr. Pickup.
Hi, Michael Pickup, Auditor General.
Tammy Squires, Assistant Auditor General.
Mike McPhee, Audit Principal.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Pickup, the floor is yours, and I'll ask you to start with some opening remarks.
Thank you so much. So the opening remarks are a little bit longer than I would normally like because I'm trying to quickly summarize 3 chapters into one. So let's get going, I guess. Chapter 1 is on the results of the financial audit work. Chapter 2 deals with the financial numbers from the public accounts. And Chapter 3 is the information piece on pensions in the public sector. As we know, the government of Nova Scotia spends approximately $11 billion a year. As such, a key way the government is accountable to the people of Nova Scotia is through the government's financial statements, and that is the reason why we are here today. In Chapter 1, I share the results of our audit of the government's public accounts, information related to audits of other organizations that are part of government, and developments in the government's fraud management program, updates on disclosure of travel and hospitality expenses within government, and finally, some inquiry on board vacancies within government organizations. I'm happy to report that for the 17th year in a row, the government received a clean audit opinion on the financial statements known as the Public Accounts of Nova Scotia. This clean audit opinion, in simple terms, means that people can rely on the numbers and the information that is in the government financial statements. This indeed sets an expectation that all future governments should also be able to produce clean financial statements. Also, most of the individual government organizations that make up the public accounts also presented financial statements. However, having said that, there is work to be done. There are some significant gaps in management controls over Nova Scotia's finances at some of the largest organizations across government. These include Housing Nova Scotia, the IWK, and the Nova Scotia Health Authority. Also, certain organizations within government have gaps in controls that have continued year after year without being fixed. Our review of the fraud risk management approach indicates that improvements are required, including implementation of fraud policies across government, and more importantly, the completion of fraud risk assessments across government as well. Also, there should be an evaluation of the need for a public servant fraud hotline as well. In the area of the disclosure of travel and hospitality expenses, disclosure is now mandatory, and I'm happy to report that it's happening across government in most organizations. This is a good thing. However, there are still improvements needed to enhance openness and transparency, including broadening the definition of who discloses executive expenses. Finally, as part of our financial statement audit work, we inquired whether government organizations have board vacancies. We found that 16 of the 48 organizations, or 33%, have indeed board vacancies. While we didn't examine what the numbers ought to be or should be, or the details of any impacts that this may have had, we do note that at a high level, this creates oversight risk. Moving on to Chapter 2, we report on the financial numbers of Nova Scotia, including several indicators which provide a picture of the province's financial position at a point in time. Our analysis and comments come from the Public Accounts of Nova Scotia, a published document, where the government provides loads of details for all to read. And our chapter is not a commentary on public policy choices made by governments today or at any time in the past. While looking at the current year information provides a picture of what happened in the last year, it is equally important that we look to what happened over the period of time before that to understand the current financial position of the government. Therefore, we have chosen to comment in the report on the last 5 years and the last 10 years on various trend items. Moving on to Chapter 3. I wanted to inform Nova Scotians on key matters related to the 3 largest pension plans for the public sector employees in Nova Scotia. By way of information, that is the plan for healthcare employees, the public service plan, and the teachers plan. This chapter is strictly an information piece. It doesn't offer any opinions or conclusions on the actual situations. But these pensions are a huge deal in Nova Scotia, not only to members of the plans, but also to all Nova Scotians, because the province contributes over $250 million a year to the plans, and because, for example, the government is on the hook directly for 1/2 of the teachers' pension plan deficit of $1.4 billion. The $1.4 billion deficit in the teachers' pension plan should be a concern to retiring teachers, and because they are unlikely to get a pension increase for the foreseeable future, I really feel they should get engaged in their financial statements. As well, all Nova Scotians are interested in this plan because of the amount of contributions that the province is also contributing. So that was really all I wanted to cover. I would like to say, while I'm taking most of the questions and doing the talking, the 2 people to my right, Ms. Squires and Mr. McPhee, really were the heavy lifters and responsible for doing all the work. And not behind them, but behind them in more figurative ways, if you will, are the many people back in the office across the street who really assisted them in doing this work and pulled this together over the summer. As a final note, I would add that this is the earliest year ever we've been able to produce this report. We've advanced this from my first year by 4.5 months, and we're getting this information to you probably as quickly as anybody in Canada is doing. So I did just want to share that and extend my thanks to the folks next to me. And that was sort of my final opening comment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pickup, and again, appreciate the timeliness of getting this. I know that's a lot of work on behalf of your staff, very competent group of people, and we appreciate that. We'll start the questioning with the Progressive Conservative Party. Mr. Houston, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the opening comments, and thank you for preparing this report for Nova Scotians. You've identified significant weaknesses, and you actually say in here, significant weaknesses and controls exist across government and risks continue. And you go on to say that the IWK is an example of what can happen when controls are not working. So significant weaknesses, and I understand the choice of the word significant is in itself significant. This is something to be concerned about. So I guess my first question would be, who's ultimately responsible for making sure that an organization has adequate internal controls? Where does that responsibility rest?
Mr. Pickup.
In response to who is ultimately responsible, if we take the 3 organizations where we've identified as having significant control weaknesses, IWK, Nova Scotia Health Authority, and Housing Nova Scotia, Those organizations, they have bodies in place like a board of directors and audit committee who really management reports to and who are responsible to answer as to why they have significant control deficiencies. Ultimately, of course, under our system, there would be accountability back to a minister from those organizations as well. So it's not all on management, if you will, to take all of the responsibility for not having these things in place. It would also be those that oversee these organizations to say, why isn't this happening? So I hope that answers the essence, I think, of what your question was as to who is responsible.
I think so, and I think the responsibility, from what I understand, would obviously first rest with the frontline workers, the people doing the jobs, and then that would flow up to management, and then that would ultimately flow up to the board. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with the minister. Is that a fair assessment?
So under our system, if we take these other government organizations outside of departments, like the three that I gave, ultimately those boards of directors have a reporting relationship back to the minister, obviously. So if someone is going to stand up in the House and explain, sort of why something is happening in one of these organizations, it's not going to be, you're not going to have a board member come in. It's going to be the minister who will answer to the question, recognizing, these organizations are on like the departments, but at the end of the day, they're all accountable to people in the House.
So based on your knowledge of the flow of information, let's call it, is there a minister in the current administration, is there a minister in the cabinet today that should be surprised by these findings? In other words, did the ministers already know about these internal control weaknesses? They're not new, are they?
So a couple of points on that. I've learned long ago not to attempt to speak for anybody else, but to give my view, views. So who knows what and those types of issues. I won't sort of try to guess. I know. Having said that, in specific response to your question, yes, when these organizations get audited and they have, for example, reports back to those charged with oversight, people on the board, the audit committees, they would know this from their auditors. The reporting beyond that up to a minister, and what a minister may know, that would be different. Now, having said that, I think in fairness, I would say that on the IWK and the Health Authority and them having weaknesses, I would have met with the Minister of Health recently to have a discussion on those.
Recently, as a result of the situation at the IWK, or previous to that even?
So it's funny how these answers are often not simple. The meeting was set prior to the IWK. The meeting happened after the issues at the IWK, but that's just by the amount of time it takes to get a meeting organized.
I guess what I'm trying to understand, because when I read this report about the significant weaknesses, it bothers me. When I read that many of these weaknesses, some control weaknesses, I use the word many, maybe that's not fair, but what your word is some control weaknesses continue year after year. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, when you have significant control weaknesses, you have the opportunity for mistakes, you have the opportunity for fraud. And I would think that the person and the people ultimately responsible for making sure that mistakes don't happen and fraud doesn't happen should be very concerned when they hear that there's weaknesses. So I guess what I'm trying to understand is, have they known for long enough that there should have been some action taken, in your opinion?
Okay. So as a context to that answer, let me be clear as the Auditor General that when an organization has significant control weakness, that's a pretty bad thing, right? I mean, things can happen that are not good, that you don't want to happen. For us to use that term, significant control weaknesses, is a big deal. It's something we put a lot of consideration into. So if you look at 50+ organizations in the government, we have 3 of them with significant control weaknesses. So it's not a title we would use loosely. Now, those 3 organizations, they're sizable. so the Health Authority, IWK, and Housing Nova Scotia. One of them, they've moved into year 3, the Health Authority, and yes, they've had to merge 9, and that has taken some work. So I've been a bit more patient, if you will, on understanding, but recognizing that I think, in year 3, these significant weaknesses need to be addressed. The IWK and Housing Nova Scotia have been around a long time, and to have significant weaknesses in controls, frankly, I don't think is a goal.
Yeah, I don't think it is either, actually. And I think unfortunately, what my takeaway from the portion on the control weaknesses and the fraud, the lack of fraud risk assessments. I mean, those things obviously go hand in hand, but sadly, it just makes me think that there's no reason to be surprised that something like what happened at the IWK actually happened, because without the proper control environment, there's an opportunity, and often when there's an opportunity, somebody will take it, right? So it was almost just a matter of time. And the fact that we know about one situation across the government that has significant weaknesses and controls across the government, there's probably more. So it's a shame to think that this was, people should have known, somebody should have been jumping up and down, and they're not. And I don't understand why they're not. Maybe they will now. In fact, I did read in your report that the Housing Authority and the IWK in particular have said they'll have measures in place by December 17 to address some of the weaknesses. Maybe it's better to close the barn door late than never, I guess, but they're saying they'll have some measures in place by December 17. Do you have any indication or any sense as to whether that's a timeline that can be met?
So I'm always hopeful and optimistic, but being the auditor that I am, show me the money, if you will, and the proof will be in being able to deliver. So I would put the the Health Authority in the same bucket to say, okay, we're in year 3. They have committed to have things done by March of 18. Being the auditors of that organization, we will be in contact with them near monthly from now till then to see what is happening. So optimistic and hopeful, but at some point it has to be, let's see that it's done.
So in terms of, you mentioned in your report that departments have not considered a fraud hotline. So a fraud hotline, and in fact, I think the only reason the IWK situation came to light is because somebody picked up the phone and called, I think, Michael Gorman at the CBC, who ultimately kind of broke the story, as I believe what happened there. So there isn't a fraud hotline, but somebody, I guess, took the initiative and had the good sense to establish their own fraud hotline. But a fraud hotline seems like a no-brainer. Is that something that departments said they would be willing to establish?
So we made the recommendation to Executive Council that they need to evaluate the usefulness of a fraud hotline, and I think it's this is not that complicated of an area to evaluate. Frankly, I mean there's lots of other jurisdictions that have been down this road and have looked at having fraud hotlines. I would also note that the science, if you will, the study of fraud is pretty clear that when you have a fraud hotline, probably 40% of the cases of fraud and potential abuse and other bad things that happen get reported through that fraud hotline. So I'm not saying go get a fraud hotline, but I'm saying let's look at government needs to look at and evaluate having the fraud hotline in place.
Is that a new recommendation on your behalf, or is that something that you've been preaching to them for a while to assess whether or not a fraud hotline is appropriate? Is it new or something?
So we've been doing this in steps, if you will. So we were pushing over the last couple of years, and as the auditor might do, to get the fraud policy in place. That's been done. We're pushing to get these fraud risk assessments in place, and we said, and by the way, we think you really need to evaluate having this fraud hotline. So it's new in terms of being a recommendation this year, because I think we've tried to move this along here to say, okay, let's see that evaluation take place.
it's new from your office. Would it be new from like the other, like there's internal audit departments and things, but it's not something that you've seen in your review of the documents. It's just something that you've suggested to them.
So in terms of the fraud hotline, if I understand, it's the first time we have specifically said, oh, and besides, you know, the comments we've made around having a fraud policy, doing fraud risk assessments, we also think you should evaluate the fraud hotline. But fraud hotlines have been, this is not like putting people in space, right? I mean, this has been around, you know, and there's lots of people doing it and lots of people have studied it. So I don't think it's not something that I would see as very cumbersome and costly to go do that evaluation to see whether you should have a fraud hotline.
Yeah, I agree with you. It seems like a little common sense thing to do, and that's why. So you've suggested it now. Presumably other people have suggested it earlier, but it just hasn't been done. So I guess my specific question to you in your review of documents that you're reviewing through your process, did you see other people recommend, hey, why don't we have a fraud hotline? And it just didn't happen, and now you're suggesting it, and maybe it'll happen now, we don't know.
I haven't seen discussion around that or evaluation of that by others, but I haven't, you know, nobody has said, yes, somebody has raised this before. So I really doubt it. And given, you know, I guess to be frank, given how long it has taken to get the fraud policy approved and in place, you know, probably that evaluation had not been done before.
Okay, I do want to talk about the boards, and there's a number of vacancies across government, across boards. There's a number of vacancies that existed at the time you were doing your, let's call it audit field work, right? What period was that? When was all this audit field work done?
So essentially, in relation to this board, we surveyed all 50 or about 50 government organizations in the winter period. Yeah. So sent that out to them and sought the information and then compiled it up until, say, July, August. So. Okay.
Do you know? So there was vacancies at a point in time when you contacted each one. Do you have any sense as to, is this a chronic issue that these? Like, were people saying, yeah, we have 3 vacancies and we've had those for 4 years, or like, do you have any sense of, is it an ongoing thing, or was it just bad luck that you happened to call on that day and there happened to be vacancies?
So we did report within the report that the length of time of how long these organizations have indicated. And in paragraph 1.32, we indicate that on average, these positions had been vacant for more than 13 months.
For more than a year? Wow,
more than 13 months.
Okay.
So that's on page 13, paragraph 1.32.
Okay, and then I know it wouldn't be covered in this, or you might not have done any follow-up, but do you have any sense as to whether most of these vacancies are filled now, or would it be the same?
So, you know, we've had to cut off at a point in time. We did make the recommendation to Executive Council that they look at this, and in their response they indicated that in September that a process has been started to address this.
Okay. Thank you for that. I'm sure we'll come back to that, but in terms of the pension plans, the teachers' pension plan in particular is a concern to me, as it will be to teachers themselves who are members of that plan. So there's a deficit. Is that a chronic deficit? Has that plan been in deficit for a long time, or has it had a couple bad years, or do you have any sense as to how that developed?
Sure. So the $1.4 billion deficit has been the same $1.4 billion for the last 3 years, for example. But we also summarize on page 40 in paragraph 3.21 what the deficit has been. And if you go, we bring it back as far back as 5 years ago. And it's been anywhere from 1.4 billion to 1.7 billion.
And I don't think you have, but I'm just wondering, have you made recommendations to I guess the board of the teachers pension fund or their pension administrator has somebody made recommendations to them as to how they can better manage the pension plan assets? Maybe it wouldn't have been you, but did you notice in your audit work somebody making some recommendations to them?
So just in terms of this chapter, this is an information piece where we really tried to summarize the story on each of these pension plans, really to bring it to the Public Accounts Committee to say, you know, here is a matter of interest, I think, in terms of public finances, but probably more importantly in terms of people's lives, in terms of teachers, for example, and what they might expect going forward. So we didn't audit the pension plan, we brought information. So we didn't make a recommendation to them. Having said that, I would suggest, with all due respect, that is a great question for this committee to say there's a $1.4 billion deficit. Why does that exist? And what's going to happen going forward? Given that, you know, as it is now, teachers who are going to retire, if this continues, they likely won't see any increase to their pension anytime in the foreseeable future.
And I'm trying to just get my head around what the relationship between the pension and pensionable earnings and the wage pattern that was imposed upon them and the withdrawal of the long service award. Does anything that, I guess, that what happens to the current remuneration of teachers impacts the valuations? Is there any relationship, or is this just, you're just looking at just the pension? Just the pension plan itself.
So drawing on that, I guess to some extent, speaking from one accountant to another, I suppose, in some ways, is that you know, how the amounts of compensation change would impact the pension contributions, because those contributions would be a percentage of the earnings that somebody makes. So that would be sort of the only link that way. I wouldn't look to make other links.
Okay. I think I'm pretty much out of time, am I?
You have 3 minutes.
Oh, okay. So,
2.5.
2.5, thank you. I will go back to the, internal controls situation. And I guess what I would ask is, now that we know, and everybody knows, that there's significant internal controls across the government, and we know that two of the organizations have said they're going to, two of the, I guess, let's call it, would they be the worst offenders in terms of control weaknesses, I guess? They have said they'll kind of clean up their internal controls by December. It's a couple months from now, and I think housing, you said, was going to be by March. So those are the three organizations that have been highlighted here as having significant internal control weaknesses, and they've all given a deadline as to when they're going to address that. What do we take away from? Is there a whole bunch of other departments that also have significant internal control weaknesses that maybe they're not in that three? So like what would be a realistic expectation for Nova Scotians sitting here to say, well, gee, you know, they should really clean this up and they should get their act together and they should do it by, like, a year from now? We shouldn't be having this discussion about significant internal control weaknesses across the government, should we?
So you've given me a great opportunity to explain what I would love to see happen, with all due respect. We bring this information forward to you to assist you in holding the government accountable and to make better government. So one of the ways perhaps to do that would be looking to holding these organizations accountable, holding the government accountable, and asking the questions in terms of, is this happening and are they dealing with it? In terms of the number of organizations, it becomes somewhat easier for you, I think, in that there are only 3 of all of them that have the significant control deficiencies. So if, for example, you know, you wanted to know what was happening at Housing Nova Scotia or IWK or Nova Scotia Health Authority, maybe you think about calling them in here to say at some point, you know, give us an update as to what's happening here and to hold them and the government accountable for that. And that's why we're producing this information for you, to assist you in holding the government accountable. So thank you for that, for the opportunity.
That was perfect timing on your answer. We'll now move to the New Democratic Party for 20 minutes. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. So just to ask a last clarifying question, following my colleague's line of questioning, can you explain why, you know, what information you had or what history you had with these organizations that led you to focus on the internal controls of the IWK, the NSHA, and Housing Nova Scotia?
Sure, and in the interest of not using up all your time, I'll try to speed it up. So maybe if I don't give you exactly what you want, you let me know, and I will expand on it. So we are the auditors of the big government's financial statements, if you will, the public accounts. That incorporates all the departments and then about 50 other government organizations. We actually do the financial statement audits of very few of those organizations. We do the Health Authority, but for most of the others, we rely on the financial statement auditors who are doing this work. As part of the annual financial statement audits that they do, they have to report to us as the big auditor of the government's public accounts, if you will, on the results of all of those individual audits. We then take all of the correspondence in terms of how they let the organizations know whether there were weaknesses in controls and things that were happening. We took all of that, and then we go through it and we say, okay, here is the picture on a consolidated basis of a snapshot of government. And I say we, it's mainly the folks to my right, but and then we summarize it all here to say, okay, out of all of this, there's 3 that have what we would call significant weaknesses. And I think that reflects that for us, you know, there's some judgment around that. It's something auditors take seriously when they use that concept of significant weakness. And that's why probably in part, most organizations, if there's 50, you only have 3. You know, the bad side is there are 3, the good side is there are 3, right? I hope that gives you sort of that enough detail. If not, I'll be more than happy to jump in on any of that more.
Thank you for that answer. I know the IWK's Chief Financial Officer and also their CEO recently resigned. Were they involved in your review that led to this report today?
So on the IWK, these control deficiencies that are picked up here, we didn't do the financial statement audit. This would have come from the results of the financial statement auditor. Having said that, we have made the decision, as allowed in the Auditor General Act and in meeting with the IWK folks, we have decided that we would start auditing the financial statements of the IWK beginning April 1st, 2018. So these results, you know, strictly come from their financial statement auditor.
Thank you. For Housing Nova Scotia, you note that finance staff can both make and approve journal entries. Can you expand on that and the problems you see with that taking place?
Sure. At a high level, you know, making and approving journal entries would lack proper segregation. So from a control perspective, you don't generally want to give an opportunity where someone can decide, okay, this is an appropriate journal entry to make, you know, debit this expense, credit this. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to approve that as well. Not the way you want things to work in accounting. So at a high level, you know, lack of segregation, it creates a real risk. You know, it doesn't mean that I can show you 850 things that happened as a result of that. But when something happens, I can say, you know, well, we did tell you that this weakness existed. You let that risk continue, and you risk the potential of something bad happening.
And in the course of your work, do you have any evidence of those risks having actually resulted in fraud or other or something approaching fraud?
Sure. So when we do these financial statement audits, we don't design these audits and we don't look to seek out fraud, for example, or to give an opinion on whether there is or isn't any fraud. What we're really attempting to do and issue opinions on are when the financial statements, you know, those 20, 25 pages of consolidated information at the end of the year are prepared. We give an opinion. Are those financial statements, are the numbers in accordance with accounting principles in Canada? So that is what the opinion is on. And when we do that, we use concepts of significance or materiality is what we would call it. So the audit didn't set out to say, you know, is there a $10 million fraud? Is there an $800,000 fraud? Having said that, you know, under auditing standards, if there is a huge fraud, a significant material one that would impact that financial reporting, right, then our work should pick that up as a regular course of the financial statement audit. But I think it is worth stressing that financial audits are not designed to pick up fraud. And in fact, the research shows that in most cases, when there is fraud in an organization, those organizations had a financial statement audit, which just further supports that wasn't designed to pick up necessarily the fraud.
Okay. You note that, these departments have been recommended to have financial risk management or fraud risk assessment done, and in many cases they have not been done or are not complete. What is the cost, maybe both in terms of financial cost, but also time to actually complete that recommendation, that fraud risk assessment?
So completing a fraud risk assessment, as a control approach, should be a reasonable cost-benefit approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all. It depends on the size of the organization. Just to give you an example, my office is a small organization. $4 million a year in expenditures, relatively small on $11 million in government expenditures. For us to do a fraud risk assessment, which we did, it was 75, 80 hours of total, but the payback from that can be tremendous. So I think if you look to an organization, we indicate on our summary that the Department of Health, for example, did a fraud risk assessment over $800 million of program expenditures. It may be an interesting discussion to ask the folks at Health to say, okay, what did that cost you? What did you get out of that? Because I would argue that the costs are relatively insignificant as to what it can protect in dollars, but also what it can protect in reputation, in people's times. If you look at some of the examples of what you see currently, a significant, in terms of the public interest dollar amount of money, when you add on to that all of the time that auditors spend, people spend, the energies consumed at a reputational and management and executive level and a board level around that, which may have been prevented in some of these other cases, could be perhaps prevented by doing a fraud risk assessment. It generally is pretty small potatoes, in my experience, to the upside of what you're getting in return.
Thank you. I'm just going to briefly turn to the chapter on the pension plans, and I just have a question about, obviously there's some very different circumstances in these different public pension plans. Looking at the teachers, I think a lot of people, when folks think about teachers' pensions, they think about the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, which is like a financial powerhouse, huge investor. Can you comment on, the obviously significant gap between that pension plan and the Nova Scotia Teachers' Pension Plan, and what would explain that?
So if I understand, it's just, and correct me if I'm not fully understanding, do you mean comparison of the Nova Scotia Teachers Plan to the other pension plans in Nova Scotia or to the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan?
Actually, I'd be interested in both comparisons, two separate comparisons.
Okay. So I'll give you the easy answer first. In comparison to the Ontario plan, we didn't do a comparison to the Ontario plan. And part of that is what drove us in doing this and what was guiding us were, yes, the numbers are important, but it was from a people perspective, right? Teachers, on average now, working teachers are paying $170 more a month in contributions. The province has kicked in an extra $52 million on top of their contributions in the last 5 years. Post-2006 teachers who retired are not getting indexing. And newly retiring teachers, they're not looking at indexing at any time soon. So part of why we did this, before I directly answer the question, is to really, if the awareness isn't there, besides whatever public policy issues this may raise for people like the Public Accounts Committee, is to drive home the point to teachers to say, we sure hope you're aware that if you're going to be retiring anytime soon, you may go a long time, if not your complete retirement, without an increase to your pension plan. which hopefully they are considering in their own personal sort of financial planning. That was the intent behind this, is to bring that awareness. Now, in answer to the direct answer to your question, I know that was a long preamble, but in comparison, for example, and these plans are all different, I get it. You know, teachers are different than healthcare workers, are different than public service, are different than MLAs. Having said that, they're all pension plans. Right? If you take the healthcare employees plan, that is sitting on a $1.7 billion surplus. Okay, so there's more assets there than the liabilities are owed. If you compare that to the teachers plan, it's the opposite. There's a deficit of $1.4 billion. There's more liabilities than there are assets. And if you take the public service plan, it's slightly surplus, somewhere in the middle, just over $200 million surplus. So you've got three plans, very, very different backgrounds. Yes, everybody gets that. But at the end of the day, you're looking at a $1.7 billion surplus over here, a $1.4 billion deficit over here, right? For roughly sort of, you know, not that much of a difference in the number of workers, 42,000 members, 32,000 members. It raises, you know, some significant questions. I think if I was a teacher or a taxpayer in Nova Scotia, so, you know, I say this chapter matters to two groups of people, teachers and those Nova Scotians who aren't teachers. Right, which is just about everybody else. You know, and you need to be saying, okay, a number of things have been tried. Government is kicking in more taxpayers' money. Teachers themselves are kicking in more. The benefit increases has pretty much stopped for new retirees, but the deficit still continues at $1.4 billion. That raises a huge question mark, I think. That is a huge question for groups like the Public Accounts Committee, who really are here to look at accountability and public money.
And just before I pass it off to my colleague, you don't have the answer for that, I guess.
I don't have the answer, but why we brought this information piece is to say, this has to be one of the major questions that exists today in terms of public finances as to how we can have a $1.4 billion deficit in the teacher's pension plan, that I don't quickly hear the, you know, sort of answer as to why or how teachers and the rest of Nova Scotians are getting out of this on a go-forward basis.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Auditor General and the staff for being here. I'm just wondering if the Auditor would agree that the estimates and assumptions are the biggest risk when preparing a budget, and I'll get into some questions after that.
I would completely agree, and I would also indicate that, you know, management accounts that way as they properly should in accordance with standards. So this is not, oh, the auditor coming and telling you something new. The accounting folks in the government are doing the right thing. They're accounting properly. But yes, to your point, the most significant things in these financial statements, really, that could change things in terms of the future, are the assumptions around estimates that are buried in those statements that derive the numbers that are the most significant numbers in the statements.
And thank you for that. And it's interesting, you know, portion of my time, especially during budget estimates that's going on right now, is to compare the estimates to estimates, but more importantly, the estimates to actual that we see and what we're provided as MLAs, because often, you know, that's where you'll see a reduction. Or what you could say, you know, some consider underspending a budget, and we've seen actuals, you know, go much higher. So it's definitely an area I think government needs to make sure that, I believe it's their job to make sure that their estimates and their actuals, you know, should be pretty close. At the end of the year, and I know there's a lot of pressures and outside information that will change that. We've heard the Premier say that the budget and the current budget is based on wage patterns, for example. And of course, I won't go into the history of the last year and a half, 2 years with the current government and their approach to you know, trying to come up with a wage pattern and negotiations with the public service. Are you able to comment at all on I think what's important is making sure that the analysis is done, the information that government uses to bring forward estimates are appropriate. Are you aware that the government has done the analysis to support their approach on the wage patterns over the next year, especially dealing with public service?
So as I keep my auditor hat on, of course, I hope I didn't confuse the issue earlier when I talked about estimates in terms of assumptions and estimates. I was talking about the accounting, the financial statements, accounting for the prior year, where there would be estimates based in some of those costs, for example. So that is the accounting side of it. But what you're talking more about are the estimates both on the revenue side and on the expense side that may make part of a budget. So my office gives a report on the reasonableness of the preparation of the revenue side of that. So looking at whether the calculations were correct, obviously not a guarantee that the revenue amounts are going to be correct. But so we do that piece of work that gets included in the budget on the revenue estimates, and we were comfortable that the revenue estimates were reasonably stated. On the expense side and looking at expense projections forward and what might happen, we don't do any work in relation to that. So our opinion absolutely does not apply to any kind of projected expense information and what might happen on that.
We know there's always reports every year, especially the last few years, around pension valuation and what the government tries to present to Nova Scotians, and of course we get the updates further in the fiscal year. Are you confident that that work is proper and reflects what's seen across the country and other jurisdictions around reporting of pension valuations and the correcting of that when they I don't know if it's make a guess or try to figure out what the expense is going to be for the province in the upcoming year?
Ms. Squires.
Thank you. So when we audit estimates or pension valuations or other employee benefit valuations, this is an area of it's not the normal process. There actually is an element of uncertainty into it. And because there's some uncertainty into it, we probably spend a little more audit effort. And I would say that is all auditors across Canada would do the same thing. When the government makes its estimate or what it feels will say would be like your wage assumption, then we would actually go make sure we have all the evidence to support that they are using that when it goes into the big formula.
So is that done on a every time the budget's produced? Does your office look at that analysis to make sure that that's to that degree on at budget time every year?
Mr. Pickup?
So with the annual budget process, the only work that we are doing in terms of giving a report on is on the revenue side. So we would look at the reasonableness of the calculations of the revenue piece and give a report on that. We are not doing anything on the projection side, on the expense side. When Ms. Squires was talking about some of the assumptions in expenses, that was historical looking. So for example, if somebody is making a pension adjustment for the March 31st, 2017 financial statements, included in there would be assumptions like future wage patterns, CPI inflationary increases, all of these types of things. But those were the assumptions for the historical statements as they might impact estimates in those statements. On the budget side itself, we do nothing with projected expenses in any way.
Okay, thank you. We only got 40 seconds or so I'm good to pass that on.
I'll give you a minute if you want.
I'm good to pass it on to
okay, thank you. Time will now revert to the Liberal Party. Mr. McKay, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Auditor General and staff, we certainly appreciate your being here with us today and appreciate the very hard work that's gone into presenting your report in a very timely manner. I might also add a very organized manner. The way it's been presented to us is very efficient and very helpful for us for our proceedings today. And we very much appreciate the role of the Auditor General's office, and we certainly recognize that it is to hold government accountable, which I might also interpret as an opportunity for government to enjoy continuous improvement, because the business of government is a busy business, and we need to continually find ways to improve, and we thank your office for being here to help us make those improvements. We take your recommendations seriously as ways that we can bring improvement to governance for all Nova Scotians. You mentioned that the province's finances have improved in some areas over the past year. And I believe that we've done that by introducing some sound fiscal policy, an approach to our financial management that has both broadened our revenue generation. If I look at areas like seafood exports, for example, where we've already exceeded the Ivany report's recommendations for seafood exports, or tourism, where we're well on our way for a record-breaking year in tourism revenues in Nova Scotia, and at the same time introducing sound spending restraints in some cases, but sound spending policies that Nova Scotians can afford. But I'd like to know if you could point out some of the areas where you believe that the province's finances have improved over this past year.
Mr. Pictou.
Sure. So in Chapter 2 on the financial information report, again, I want to remind everybody that all of this information that we are selecting and pulling out is all provided in detail right now in the public accounts of Nova Scotia. So we're not coming here necessarily with new information. So I always like just to make sure I take time to give credit to the accounting folks who are preparing all this information on behalf of government, that this is all there, and they are doing a solid job of pulling this together. So I do just want to recognize that is happening now. In direct response, to your question on the summary that we prepared for Chapter 2, what we have done is sort of given a picture to say, here is the 2017 results. Here was what the financial numbers show for that 1 year. Here's what they show for the 10-year period. So if you look at sort of the two big boxes on that summary, clearly the results for 2017 show a surplus of $150 million, some decrease in the net long-term debt, and a small drop in the annual interest cost, but still averaging about $750 million a year for each of the last 5 years. So from that perspective, we are saying the 2017 results, dollar amounts, without commenting on policies and what was happening to produce this. The plain and simple of it is the 2017 results show better financial results than the year before.
Thank you for that, and I certainly appreciate the shout out to the financial sections of the various government departments, and we certainly agree they're doing a very good job, and we're glad to see that the very first comment made in your overall conclusions is that government's financial statements meet accounting standards, and yes, very attributable to the work being done in organizations across government. On the net debt per capita, I believe it's section 2.17, page 28. You certainly note here that net debt has increased by $2,534, but it should be pointed out that 63% of that increase occurred in the 2012 to 2017 period. But I want to go down to 2.19, actually, is the more appropriate one, where we look at net long-term debt, which has decreased by $400 million over the prior year. And I know when we talk about billions of dollars, that may seem like a small amount, but $400 million is a significant number. And I think we do have to pay attention to that. And we should note that 87% of that $3 billion increase that occurred, however, during the long-term debt occurred in the 2017 to 2012 period prior to the present government taking its role. And in section 2.20, immediately below that, when we look at the net long-term debt per capita, where we see that this has also decreased in 2017. And while it may have increased over the 10-year period, again, 87% of that increase occurred prior to this government taking its role. It occurred in the 2007 to 2012 period. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to those numbers a little bit.
Sure. So what we have provided here, and this is why I may have indicated earlier, is that 1 year does not a trend make. So I think it's important to look at 5-year periods, 10-year periods, both looking back and looking forward. So the information is there. The idea of why we spread it out over the years is to foster a discussion, I think, that government can have with Nova Scotians as to say, here's what the changes in numbers have been, here's what you've received for this, here is the going forward, here is what this is. So I think that is the point, I think, of spreading it out and showing a 10-year analysis so that I think people can do sort of what you just suggested to say, okay, let's break that down into periods of time. And, I'm just presenting information without comment sort of on policy as to when debt is good, when debt is bad. What I'd like to put forward is, at the end of the day, the impact of the 10-year cycle of the last 10 years has been interest on debt of $7.5 billion, and I think, in simple terms, that's, how do you relate to $7.5 billion? Well, that's 2 years of healthcare costs for every single one of us in this province.
Right. Thank you very much for that response. And I guess similarly that would hold when we look at the annual interest on long-term debt, which, as you note in 2.23, has declined over the past 5 years. The other point I'd like to expand on a bit is in your summaries on the 2017 annual reports is that departments got an extra $234 million. And to my interpretation, we look at this with the increases in spending in healthcare, for mental illness, for example, for education with the pre-primary classes that this government's introduced, and the ability of this government to broaden our revenue base while being very using good governance on our spending, I think, has allowed us to make these investments in these sorts of programs that will benefit Nova Scotians. But my question is, with these things, we are also addressing a larger population in Nova Scotia. We are at an all-time high as far as our population, based on, I think, more jobs that keep young Nova Scotians here in the province, and in some cases attracting Nova Scotians here, as well as a very broad immigration program attracting new immigrants here. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are as to the impact that an increasing population will have on the financial situation of the province.
So it's a very interesting point, and I particularly like the segue that will give me, if you will, into the importance of projections and looking forward, because you talk about what the projected changes in population will mean, and we haven't done any work on that in terms of auditing that to say, looking forward, this might happen, that might happen, but I think all of those types of discussions are significant. Now, where we did go in this report is, if you refer to page 34, we've looked at the changes in population over a 10-year period, and we say essentially the population in Nova Scotia has gone up about 2% in the last 10 years. And we say an interesting discussions for Nova Scotians to engage in is to say healthcare costs have gone up 46% in 10 years. Population has gone up 2%. What does that mean going forward? And I'm not saying in and of itself those numbers mean nothing. 2% increase in population, 46% increase in healthcare are numbers, right? What the meaning behind them would be is to the why is this happening? What does this mean going forward? Because if you look on page 34, where we talk about the distribution of the population, what we're seeing is that group in the 65 plus in the last 10 years is up a third. So we've gone from 15% of the population being over 65 to 20% of the population being over 65 in 10 years. And that is fairly evenly split as to who that's coming off to in terms of the groups. There's less people under 17, 3% less from 20 to 17, and less people in that 18 to 64. So to go back to your sort of point about looking forward, I think that in many ways that's the whole point of historical financial statements. Yeah, they tell you where you are, they tell you the cumulative effects of years of decisions, but they inform a discussion as to what this means on a go-forward basis. So does it mean anything, for example, that the number of people over 65 are up a third in 10 years? How does that relate to 46% increase in healthcare? Does it? I don't have the answers to those things, but the point of bringing this forward to you folks is to give you some information to perhaps engage in those types of discussions with the people running government.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And certainly without this sort of information, we will make more informed decisions with this sort of information. Our last budget also included significant tax relief for small business. And we're going to have a significant number of small businesses across the province paying less tax, which will enable them to invest back into their businesses, to grow their businesses and grow the number of jobs offered there. We've also made a significant tax cut for 500,000 plus Nova Scotians, and allowing younger families and seniors to retain more money. A lot of those tax cuts are going to help certainly the least advantaged or the disadvantaged, as well as the middle class income earners here. How do you see the positive fiscal position created by making these opportunities for Nova Scotians to retain more money, both in the businesses and the individuals?
So spoken like an auditor, you may think, but I'm going to look sort of March 31st, 2017 and previously. So on page 25, we provide a snapshot in paragraph 2.7 of some of what you're talking about. So we look at what has happened in terms of taxes over the last 10 years. So, we see a 56% increase in personal income taxes, 55% increase in corporate income tax, 57% increase for HST, and there the numbers lie. So, I'm presenting the numbers to you to say, here's what has happened to those things. We also see, as we indicate, over the last 10 years, personal income taxes per filer are up 49%. Those are just numbers, right? I mean, the questions around that really are, have incomes gone up? Are people paying more personal tax because they're making more money? Have tax rates changed? What else has happened? So I think, we don't go forward. We're doing something at present and going back, but even the backward look, these numbers don't tell you the story. They give you information to ask questions around the story, I think.
Okay, thank you for that. We recently learned that Standard & Poor's has increased Nova Scotia's, or improved, I might say, improved Nova Scotia's long-term bond rating to A+ positive, and this sounds like good news for the province. How would you interpret that sort of rating by an internationally recognized organization like Standard & Poor's improving our bond rating?
So I think in terms of looking back at the numbers and saying, okay, here's a story around the numbers, and then I would pose something like that in terms of an accountability discussion around the fact that, for example, if you look back over the last 10 years and you break that 10 years into 2 5-year chunks, last 5 years, interest on the debt per year, around 750 million. The 5 years before that, around 750 million in terms of average interest paid per year. So I would say, that would inform a discussion in terms of your question. That would inform a discussion to me as to say, well, the question would be, how do you see that? And it would be a question for government. How will that change, that interest that's being paid, which hasn't changed in terms of 5-year averages over the last 5 years or the 5 years before that? What will it do to interest rates? So are those ratings and things like that, which sound very positive, are they going to impact the interest rates that are paid? Are they going to change change the amount of debt that we have? Are they going to change the interest that we pay? So, you know, we're looking backwards and we're saying, you know, here is this information based on 10 years. What will that mean going forward based on what you just said?
Okay, thank you for that. I'm just reflecting on comments by other members of the committee, one of which was maybe that your office might take on the audit responsibilities for other organizations that report up through government. A sound idea which has to be looked at and considered. We would certainly like to look at what the cost of that is going to be, and I reflect on that particularly with the thought of adding a fraud line, a hotline, and I'm concerned that we might create a $500,000 department or organization to try to catch $50,000 in fraud, and I think your recommendation to Executive Council that this be looked at will be looked at seriously, and but it will be looked at from both the cost and the revenue side of things. Finally, I just say that this government's balanced the budget for the past 2 years, and it's our intent to continue that as we go forward. And I'd just like to end up by asking your comments on what might be the impact of delivering balanced budgets for the past 2 years and going forward.
Again, I won't comment on what might happen in terms of, you know, pluses and minuses and numbers. I mean, the math would be simple. I would say, you know, all of that should be housed on, again, what will this do to the amount of debt that the province has? You know, there's, what, $15 billion in debt, and I think that would raise the question is, what is the plan to pay down that debt? When will it be gone? And what will anything that happens do to the amount of interest that is paid? Recognizing, again, like I said, I'm not making the point that, you know, the number is good or bad. I'm making the point is the number is the number, and at the end of the day, if the government has paid $7.5 billion in interest in the last 10 years, that's 2 years of healthcare costs. So any of this stuff really, you know, the flow through should be, how is it going to impact these 10-year trend information, and what and when will that flow through so that things like interest, for example, are less. So I wouldn't have the answers to that. That would be for, you know, government to be accountable to the people on.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chair, how's our time?
3 minutes. 3 minutes, approximately? Okay. Well, again, I believe you mentioned, and correct me, that did I understand that only 3 organizations across government are actually showing significant control deficiencies? Was that correct?
Right, it's 3, and I think that's very important that of the 50+ organizations, there are 3 of them that have that sort of significant control deficiencies or weaknesses, so it is isolated to 3. Now, having said that, one of them alone spends 20% of the government's budget.
Yes, well, certainly the ratio sounds good, yes, 3 out of 50, and we're going to take active measures, I believe, to bring the others into a more positive reporting structure. But I think that I take that as good news. The health authority, as I understand, is the one that is that has made commitments to you that they will straighten things out by the end of this year, and certainly we as government will closely watch that and assist your office in ensuring that that comes to take place. The other 2 organizations being the Housing Authority and IWK, and of course you're already taking an active role with IWK. The Housing Authority, I think Executive Council will be considering that seriously as well as to what can be done there, and will direct the Minister responsible to look into that situation. So again, thank you. We appreciate very much the opportunity to make improvements in governance so that we provide better services for all Nova Scotians.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn it over to the Progressive Conservative Party. We have 12 minutes for each. Mr. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciated my colleague offering that moment of levity when he found some good news in the fact that only 3 organizations had significant control weaknesses. I don't know, maybe it's half full, I guess, but 3 3 organizations spending almost half the provincial budget having significant control weaknesses is not good news to me, and it won't be good news to very many Nova Scotians outside of perhaps my colleagues' Liberal caucus. I was actually sitting here and I was wondering how it could be that significant control weaknesses would exist for year after year, and I was trying to get my head around that. And then I realized just how it was. Perhaps the government was so busy patting itself on its back that they couldn't get around to addressing some of the significant control weaknesses that are plaguing too many of our organizations in government, too many being even just one, Mr. Chair. But it makes me wonder, and Mr. Pictou, you referenced earlier a meeting that you had with the health minister to discuss the weaknesses at I think it was at the IWK specifically, but it might have been the Health Authority and the IWK. And you mentioned that you had requested that meeting at one point in time, but by the time the meeting actually happened, it was after the IWK, let's call it situation, had become public, and maybe the making public of the IWK situation gave a sense of urgency to have the meeting. But I don't want to read too much into it. I just want to ask you specifically if you can kind of lay out the timeline as to when you had reached out for the meeting with the minister to discuss the significant control weaknesses that ultimately we all learned about.
Sure. At the risk of going from memory and not having my calendar in front of me, and I did just want to clarify, on my part, that was a statement of fact, not a complaint in any way, or a judgment. When we completed the end of our public accounts work, late July, early August, we had decided then that we would look to reach out with the minister to talk mainly at that point about the control deficiencies at the Health Authority. Right, and then also we were getting the information in from the other auditor, so it made sense to talk to him about the IWK stuff as well. So summer being summer, and all of our calendars being what they are into August, you know, the time that would fit would roll into September. So you know, but that date had been set right from the get-go. That was the best that the both of us could do in terms of the timeline. And what was key for me was to make sure to sit down and have that discussion before I came here today. So again, that's, you know, that wasn't a reflection of, in my view, the degree of importance on his part. It was a reflection of the reality of two folks with calendars in August. Okay. And the purpose of the meeting would have been known to, like, hey, I want to meet with you to talk about the significant control weaknesses at the Health Authority? Probably we would call it something the results of the audits of the Health Authority. Okay. Yeah. I do want to go back to the fraud hotline. And you mentioned earlier that these are kind of commonplace. These exist in various places. My colleague mentioned maybe the need to do a cost-benefit analysis to see whether they thought that might be a good idea, and he put some arbitrary numbers out there that would cost $500,000 for a fraud hotline, and maybe you only catch 50 grand in fraud. But I would just like your thoughts on the importance of whether it's a fraud hotline or the ability for members that work in organizations to have a mechanism to stand up and speak out, particularly when it's known to the public that there are significant control, with significant internal control weaknesses, you're almost then having to rely on staff to stand up. So can you give us some thoughts on whether a fraud hotline, just in your opinion, is something that makes sense, or is it something that we should kind of run some spreadsheets and see if we should do that or not? Sure. So at the risk of not using all the remaining time that you have on one of my favorite topic areas, I will start at a higher level. So our recommendation was, as it is with most control issues, is for an evaluation to occur, because at the end of the day, it is management and government who make the calls on management controls and on having approaches in place, not the auditor. What we make recommendations, we make suggestions, and if organizations accept the risk of not doing something or or don't do that evaluation, well, you know what, that's for them to make that call. So that was why we had suggested, doing an evaluation. Now, having said that, I believe that the studies are fairly clear that having a fraud hotline can serve not only as a way to catch fraud in terms of catching, I think the research shows probably 40% of fraud cases are caught through a phone hotline. It also has been shown to be effective as a deterrent. Okay, so never mind the things that you actually catch, but what about that deterrent aspect? But all of that is, I'm not going to do the evaluation for government because that's for them to do, and it's for them to decide and tell people, we've done this, we think we should do this, and have the hotline because A, B, C, or we're not going to do this because we accept the risk and we don't think it's of benefit. The other thing I would add is that, unfortunately, we can't underestimate, and again, I say this just as an observer to it, we can't underestimate how when these things happen, not only the dollar cost involved directly, but the dollar impacts on what happens in all around that as a result of that. So if you suddenly start, because controls didn't work, because things didn't happen that may have been or could have helped deter, then you get into, hiring auditors, you get into, significant board time, management time, and then the reputational risk that an organization who may be running a business of doing A, B, and C, all of a sudden are spending all their time dealing with something around an issue that may have been, on the surface of it, seeming fairly insignificant in terms of dollars of a total budget. So having said all that, that's some context and some of my views, but I do go to the point that an evaluation should be done by those who run the government, and they should explain to people why they make that decision, keeping in mind all of what I just said.
Thank you. Your most recent audit of the health authority was for the year ended March, and it took place in the summer, right?
So we reported pre-June 30th for their reporting, to meet their reporting deadline.
Okay. So in preparing for that audit, were the internal control weaknesses that had previously been identified in the prior year, were they so disturbing to you that you had to change your audit approach in order to get to the point where you could give a clean opinion on the audit?
So one of the benefits we have being year two is the historical information we had from being the auditor the year before. So we knew as being the auditor the year before, in the first year of creation of the authority, that we couldn't rely on the controls in order to do our audit. We'd have to do what we call a test of detail type of audit approach. So we knew that going into year two. So when we came into year two, we looked to see if any of the significant amount of the control weaknesses that we had from the year before, things that we had identified, things that were in draft, had been done to the point where we could change our audit approach and say, suddenly, it's year two, we can do controls reliant. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. We were still stuck with this test of detail approach and couldn't rely on the controls that were in place. So my message would be pretty clear. I mean, I said the same thing to the audit committee to say, it's not a great thing when your auditor comes and tells you, they're not going to be able to rely on your controls. And even worse than that, you don't know that they exist for management purposes. So, and I've tried to balance that out, to be frank, with the fact that they've just finished year two. They've amalgamated nine authorities who, I don't know what the audits were like before that. I'm guessing they probably weren't controls reliant audits existing in those predecessor organizations, but I don't know that.
So as you prepared for your year two audit, you had a degree of optimism that in the year that had passed, somebody might have taken the internal control weaknesses seriously enough to address them. A year passed, and you thought, well, gee, maybe somebody thinks should be looked at, and you prepare for your audit, and you get in there, and you say, guess what? Nobody took them serious. Nobody's done a thing. We can't rely on a controls-based audit. We have to go back to a substantive-based audit. I mean, I was asking earlier about who would have known and when, and to try and answer the question in my own mind as to why they didn't look at them. And I guess that's the best answer I could have got, is that if you knew and you would have explained them to the health authority board and the minister at the time, a year ago, and it's just disappointing to me that nobody takes them serious. Maybe they will now because the fraud has come to light. Maybe they might not take them serious. Maybe they might be like my colleague who says, "Well, it's only 50 grand. It's no big deal." I hope that's not the sentiment of the governing party. But I guess time will tell. Do you have any comments on your reaction to coming in a year later and seeing the controls hadn't been addressed?
So, you know, as the auditor, we try to say, you know, approach this as an auditor would, while recognizing to some extent, okay, there's a history here, there's something different here, so let's put that into context. But as I've said to the health authority, you know, I think we've moved now from that point of, you know, you can only be new for so long, and now it's time to see these things through. They've made a commitment to get these things done by March 31st, 2018. I would suggest, with all due respect, I mean, you folks could play a role in helping with that, in terms of calling these folks in and asking them, are they dealing with these things? And we'll be doing our planning in short term for the next year's audit, and one of the things we'll be doing is going back to look as to whether these control weaknesses have been addressed.
Thank you. I hope so. The Bank of Canada has recently started raising interest rates. We have a lot of debt in the province. Have you seen any sensitivity analysis done by the Department of Finance or anyone else in the government that would kind of illustrate the impact of illustrate the impact of like, let's say what if rates go up 2 to 3%? Are we going to be able to service our debt? Has anyone looked at these types of scenarios?
Ms. Squires, less than a minute.
Okay, thank you. So one of the recommendations or points that we do bring to the government's attention is, while there's a lot of information in the public accounts and in the front section, is that sensitivity analysis being added in there, meaning what happens to your debt if interest goes up 1% or goes down 1%. That's just a very simple example of sensitivity. In the financial statements are a good place to put some of that information, or in the front section of the public accounts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll now move to the New Democratic Party. They have 12 minutes. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to continue on with Chapter 1 of your audit, and specifically around the large government organizations that you have identified with significant weaknesses. Of course, that's Housing Nova Scotia, IWK, and the Nova Scotia Health Authority. I want to go to the Nova Scotia Health Authority first, and in your charts that you provided, page 7, for example, you said the control weaknesses with the NSHA were that the improvements to policies and procedures were needed, weak controls over procurement, payment processing, and payroll processing. And of course, you indicate the management response next to that, and under those under the Nova Scotia Health Authority heading, it said, will the response from the, I would assume the NSHA was that they'll have observations, the observations will be fixed by March of 2018. So the first question, is that a response from NSHA, or was that a government response, say from the Department of Health?
Ms. Squires.
That is a response and a commitment from management at the Health Authority as well as the Audit Committee.
Okay. Is this, in your opinion, an appropriate timeline to correct the weaknesses that that you identified in the audit?
Okay.
Mr. Pictou.
So, you know, to go back to something I said before, I think we've tried to be sort of recognizing and be reasonable in our approach, recognizing that when these controls don't exist, you know, you have potential for bad things to happen. I think at the March 31st, 2018 is as long as I think we would want to go without these things being addressed. So I don't think there should be any slippage from this. I think, you know, I hope to see the authority carry through on these things. The Audit Committee has committed to it. So I really would not want to see those things go beyond that.
Well, it's thank you for that. It's It's worth noting the other two organizations, the Housing Nova Scotia IWK, the Housing is indicated that they'll fix the issues by December 2017, which is a few months away. The IWK has indicated that they will fix the observation that you noted also by December. So should we be concerned that out of the three large organizations that you've identified significant weaknesses, two of them I would say are acting quite quickly. I mean, December is only a few months away, but Nova Scotia Health Authority is well over a year. And I know through past audits, you do your audit review and you produce a document that shows the recommendations that have been implemented, and it kind of is in a 2-year cycle, if I'm not mistaken. Should we be concerned that the other two large organizations that are overseeing large amounts of money are moving quicker than the Nova Scotia Health Authority? And should we be demanding a quicker response from the Nova Scotia Health Authority?
So I think it would be, in terms of oversight, asking the health authority and monitoring through possibly meeting with them of whether they are on track to meet that. We will know that from an audit perspective. We will be there, and this is what they have put forward. To some extent, it goes back to what I said before in terms of the people making these choices as to how long it takes them to do this, when they do it, are management and the board and those running the organization and with oversight, right? It's not for the auditors. So in some ways, how the audit happens reflects what they do. So while we're hopeful and optimistic, we don't want to see that March 18 date slip beyond that. How the committee would like to do its oversight, I think, is an issue for the committee, and whether that's speaking with them or doing some other means is really up to the committee.
Would you agree that there is some onus on the Department of Health, on the minister, on the government to ensure that the organizations like NSHA, who oversee implementation of important services, respond in a timely manner? So there must be a connection between the responsibility for NSHA, but also the Department of Health. I mean, they ultimately oversee that organization. So is there an onus, a responsibility on the government, on the department to have a say in what timeline is appropriate or not appropriate in this case?
So ultimately, answering to any of these organizations, of course, in the House, and ultimately being accountable would be the ministers who have these organizations in their portfolio. Recognizing that the complicated business of government, if you will, has different structures in place and different governance. So you have these organizations that are quasi-independent, have boards, are working in this way, but still have some relationship with the Deputy Minister of Health, and ultimately who all report up to the minister who must answer for all of these organizations. So I think it would be fair in terms of the accountability regime. Ultimately, I suppose he would answer to the House and to all Nova Scotians on, are these things being done? How do you know they're being done? When are they being done? And what are you doing about it? That would be the ultimate level, keeping in mind that these organizations are set up, with boards of directors to do certain roles as well. So it's a little bit complicated, but at the end of the day, it's one person who ultimately speaks for it.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting that you mentioned boards, and you've indicated that there's some 33% of government organizations have vacancies on the board, and yet I don't believe the NSHA are on the list, but the IWK is on there. It's interesting, the payroll processing I've seen under the control weaknesses that you identified, and if people recall last fall, we learned that the Health Authority took some $7 million from a restricted fund to cover payroll and other expenses, and at the same time the Department of Health still owed NSHA some $70 million. So I'm wondering, are you able to provide any update whether the Department of Health still owes that money? Do you have any comments on the role of the Department of Health when it comes to internal controls, especially with NSHA, if you have concerns around payroll and that transpired last fall?
Ms. Squires.
Thank you. The Department of Health, yes, did owe the Health Authority some money at the end of the year, but not for payroll. The Health Authority did not use its restricted funds during the year 2016 and 17. They were very conscious of that and made sure that did not happen. And the control over payroll, yes, there's a weakness, but I just want to point out that nothing came to our attention that would indicate anything bad happened during our audit. But there was definitely a weakness over payroll processing.
Okay. All right, and maybe that'll be some questions we'll have for the minister and the government. I do want to quickly go to the boards. I know it's interesting to see the vacancies and the number of vacancies. Some seem to be, I would consider adequate. You know, there are times throughout the year that that there will be vacancies. But the interesting one is about the IWK, and why do we not know the how long that vacancy has been there? Is it something they just didn't provide that information by the time the document was printed, or they refused to give that, or they don't know how long the vacancy at the IWK has been?
So as we wrote in our report on page 13, we actually don't know. Those two vacancy positions are at the discretion of the Minister of Health, who has at this point of time chosen not to fill those vacancies.
It's interesting. I mean, boards and the vacancies on there, you know, have to be approved. Many of them have to be approved by cabinet, and it's noted this summer that, you know, every other week there seemed to be no cabinet. And it's interesting, after the election I was appointed to the HR committee, which for the first time, and we haven't met. We just met recently to make a few board approvals and pass them through the committee. So I know it's one committee that, from my recollection, met every month other than during an election. So it's no wonder that 33% of the organizations have vacancies. But I'll pass the remainder of my time over to my colleague.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you. Just quickly on the fraud line, when you put this forward as a possible measure to take, do you envision the other end of the phone line being in your office or elsewhere in government?
What a wonderful question. So we haven't had any discussion, because first I think the issue is one, to some extent, to the government to decide, okay, they need to evaluate and see where they want to go with this. If the government was to come forward and say, we've decided A or B, A being yes, we want to engage in a discussion on how to go about this. We would like to have a conversation with you in terms of how this would work. Well, we are here to serve the House, and we are here to, fulfill our responsibilities. If the government wishes to engage in that discussion, we'll be all ears, and we'll sit down and have a chat as to, including whether that would make the most, efficient and effective approach as well. But all of that, I would think, could come through an evaluation in terms of looking at this on the cost side of the structure to say, what are other governments doing? You go to Ontario, they have fraud hotlines. How much is that costing? Who is doing it? What are the benefits? So I think it's probably relatively easy to scope this stuff out. But again, when and if the government wants to talk about this, I'm just across the street.
Okay. Jumping slightly with my minute perhaps remaining. You note that, how many seconds?
20.
Oh, you know what? I don't think I'm even going to bother. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll now move to the Liberal Party, Ms. Suzanne Lowness Croft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go to the IWK. So I haven't had a chance to, of course, read the entire report, so I've been listening, and I just, when you were requested to go into the IWK, where did the request come from?
Okay, so in terms of the request on the performance audit type of work that we're now doing?
No, with the expenses.
Okay, so just in terms of this whole umbrella, because I think it's just, I need to set the stage, if you will, for what we are doing there. So the chair of the board reached out, and we had numerous discussions with the chair of the board and the chair of the audit committee around this issue and around us doing potential performance audit work, which they did request us to do. And then we also had a discussion around doing the financial statement audit. So it was very much a cooperative back, and certainly I've been nothing but impressed with the level of cooperation that I have received from the chair in terms of meeting on this. But I do want to remind you, though, that they can make requests, but we don't do audit work at IWK strictly or because or a factor of what they requested. So they made a request for us to do work. We could have gone about and done that, whether or not they made their request. And once they make a request, we are not limited to what that request is in terms of the performance audit. We can look at what we want, how we want, and who we want. And they get that, and they're cooperating with us. And then the other key part of this is not unlike how you see us here for all this other work, when we do that performance audit work at IWK, it'll be you folks that we're coming back to. We'll be reporting to the House. Obviously, we'll do the proper reporting with that organization, but we'll report to the House on the results of that performance audit work. So I know that's a long answer in terms of how we came about to where we are, but I think it's just important context.
Okay, so they were doing their own internal audits?
So a couple of things in relation to their audit work. So they had an annual financial statement audit done by an audit firm. We could have been doing that audit, but we weren't, just like we don't do many of the financial statement audits. So they had that external audit firm doing the annual financial statements. Then they had that same firm do this selected work that resulted in this report on those executive expenses. So there was the annual financial, which resulted in some of these deficiencies, and then there was this extra piece of work. Now, they've also engaged in some internal audit work as well with the Internal Audit Centre of the Government of Nova Scotia. And then along comes us to have discussions with them and for us to decide that we're going to do the financial statement audit now, and we're going to do this performance audit work. So a lot of audit work going on in that one organization, and I hope I haven't made that totally convoluted.
So can you just highlight how your audit is different than the internal ones that have taken place?
Okay, so when the IWK, for example, engaged the audit firm to do the financial statement audit, those audits are done in accordance with audit standards. We will do a financial statement audit and have an audit opinion on the statements, just like the predecessor external auditor would have an opinion on those financial statement audits. So that is one piece, which is pretty standard, whether you're in private sector, public sector, or who's doing the audit. So there's that external piece. So it's not really internal, it's an external piece. This performance audit work that we're doing and that we will do, nobody else is the performance auditor of IWK. Under the Auditor General Act, it's us who would do that work independently in terms of deciding what to do, how to do it, and on the reporting as well. But both of those, the financial statements and the performance, are external audit work. So when you're talking about internal audit work, maybe you're referring to them going to hire a firm to do, okay, you did the financial audit, but also look at this. Or they go to the government has an internal audit center, or they go to them and say, do some internal audit work for us as well.
Okay, so do you know how often do they just do an annual internal audit, or do they have like quarterly reports that would come to the board of directors?
So I'll answer the easy part of that first, which is on the external audit, on those financial statement audits, just like we audit the health authority every year, they would have had a financial statement audit done by an audit firm and reported to the board. So that's the easy part of the answer. In terms of any internal financial reporting, performance reporting, financial, non-financial information up through the audit committee to the board, I wouldn't have the answer to that at this point. I mean, some of that may become clearer as we go through these audits ourselves, but I wouldn't have the answer right now as to what is happening there. Similarly, I wouldn't have the answer at other organizations that we don't audit as well, right?
Mm-hmm. So how public will your audits be?
So the performance audit that we do will be tabled, just like every performance audit we do, in the House, so directly to the House. Because I like to say, you know, our client, we serve the House. We audit organizations and we work hard to get along with the organizations we audit, but they are not ultimately our client. Ultimately our client is the House, the Legislature, and the people. So we report directly to the House. So that is on the performance audit cycle. On the financial audit, because financial audits are generally fairly standard, you know, we go through this work, we have an auditor's report. Those auditor's reports, they would table with their financial statements on their website. Mm-hmm. Each year.
So your financial statement, I believe it says here, starting April 1st, 2018. Mm-hmm. So will you be reporting for the year 17 on that, or will you just begin your whole process?
So, you know, good catch. So in terms of those fiscal years, because it is different. So the fiscal year beginning April 1st, 2018 will be the year end March 31st, 19. So the current year, under the current fiscal year happening right now, is the 17-18. So the audit firm that is now will finish up that audit. I mean, they've been engaged, they're doing their work. Let them finish, and then we'll come in April 1st and pick that up there. And you know, we were, you know, when I met with the chair of the board of IWK, you know, we were on the same page that made the most sense. We need to have a little bit of orderly structure here into how we get into this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I'd like to switch to board and vacancies, and I was pleased to hear that the member from Sackville mentioned that HR has sat, and last week I sit on that committee as well, and we did pass a number of vacancies, positions for vacancies. So I think we are trying to move along there with getting approvals and whatnot. But I want to just talk about how challenging, you know, boards are in filling positions, period. I sit on several boards and many more before I became an MLA. And it's really hard, you know, I know we have vacancies all the time on boards, you know, we have acting chairs and acting vice chairs and whatnot. It seems to be more like a trend now. It's challenging to find volunteers to sit on boards. I think they're huge time commitments for people. You know, their obligations are quite demanding. And I'm just wondering, can you recommend ways that maybe boards need to look at their operations in order to enhance the numbers a bit, or maybe decrease numbers?
Sure. So in this work, what we didn't do was sort of look at what the numbers ought to be. So we sort of accepted going into this. Government has decided that these are the number of board members they want in order to fulfill oversight. So we just looked at that. Having said that, I mean, you know, if government wants to look at, which probably makes some sense in terms of what the numbers ought to be. So now we're dealing with, these are the numbers, here's what you have against that. But if there's a discussion around what those numbers ought to be, you know, that is something that government itself should look to evaluate. And I'm sure there's all kinds of sort of best practices, all kinds of governance types of organizations that exist to say, you know, given sort of the risk profile, because it's not one size fits all here, of course, right? I mean, there's a lot of different parameters to look at in determining the right size of a board. So I think all of that would probably form a part of an evaluation that government itself would have to do.
Right. So I'd like to know, like, do you offer a template for fraud assessment that departments can try to follow?
So in terms of the departments themselves, 3 of the 18 which have done the fraud risk assessments, there is some approach there in terms of, there's the Internal Audit Centre of Government that has been doing some of this work. So it's not, you know, to some extent this stuff is available. So I would encourage, which I have, is the government departments to look to the Internal Audit Centre of Government and the people who are doing this sort of on behalf of many of these organizations. Look to them to say what is a quick way to do this. And again, I would say, you know, like most things, this should make sense. right? You don't want, you know, if it's a small organization with 3 people that spends $100 a year, you probably don't need to spend $50,000 to go do a fraud risk assessment. You know, if you're a $2 billion a year organization with 20,000 employees, realistically, the fraud risk assessment is probably going to take you a bit longer, you know, than it would in an organization of 3 people spending $100. So all that to say, you know, this is not, you know, a brave new world of fraud risk assessments. There's a lot of, you know, approaches that are there that are case history, that the Internal Audit Centre can work with organizations to move this forward. And in fact, I would think, with all due respect, that would be a great thing to have the folks come in and talk about from the Internal Audit Centre of Government to say, you know, what is the approach that is being rolled out? How is this going to happen? And then maybe if you want more understanding, that would be a great way of doing it.
And you referenced Ontario has a fraud line?
So if you go,
process?
for example, if you, and you know, we didn't put this in the report because we didn't want to do a cross-Canada survey. I also don't want to suggest, and part of why it's not in the report is, you know, we're sticking to the point that this is a management decision they need to evaluate. So part of why we didn't say this province has it, this one doesn't, this one does, I don't know all the circumstances around that and why they made that decision. But if you go, for example, within a program or an area within the Ontario government, you'll find like a fraud hotline even at the program level. So if you get a program like their equivalent, I think, of community services, right? You go on that page, the website for that department, right away you got the fraud hotline there, and employees and outside folks know the number to call. But again, it's not for me to tell, you know, tell the government, you need a fraud hotline here, you don't need one there, and this is what time it should work, and all of those are management decisions. Recognizing, I think, in the bigger context of things, that when you don't have some of these control structures in place, you'd make the decision on how much risk you want, and if something happens as a result, you deal with it then.
Okay.
Order. Time has expired for questions. I'd like to thank all 3 parties for their in-depth questions at short notice, having a look at that this morning, and certainly thank our witness. So if you have a few closing remarks you'd like to have, Mr. Pickup, you have the floor.
Sure. This may surprise you, but they're fairly brief. So in conclusion, I want to, you know, thank you all for your interest in the work that we do. You know, some of my colleagues, when I meet with the Auditors General from across the country, you know, certainly have a lot of respect, I guess is the word I would use, for your level of interest in our work and the fact that the public accounts and financial statement work is important enough to come here. So, you know, on behalf of, I guess, everybody sort of in that system, you know, I'm really glad that days like today happen, mainly because this is a tool for you to hold the government accountable, to make better government. At the end of the day, Nova Scotia received a clean audit opinion on their financial statements. People need to be proud of that. They need to recognize that, you know, public accounts, accounting, accountability is all founded on the basis of proper accounting. If you didn't have that proper accounting to start with, you know, a lot of the discussions we would be having here today would not even be on the table, because we would be talking about the lack of proper accounting. So I do just want to stress that again to say, yes, you know, a lot of serious things to deal with here, but let's not lose sight of the fact that Nova Scotia can be proud of having 17 years of clean financial statements. So I think I would close with something you know, similar to as I started, to not only thank you, but to thank the folks again to my right, and to the folks across the street who may be watching as well, many of whom gave in long hours this summer to be able to produce this. So I want to say thank you to all of them again.
Thank you very much. And again, also from us, thanks to Mr. McPhee, Ms. Squires, and yourself, Mr. Pickup. It's a tool that I'm sure that we'll be going through to use to better our government in the future, and appreciate the timeliness of getting it. So upon that, thank you. We have a little bit of committee business, nothing really too heavy. I just want to make sure to inform the members that the Auditor General's office advises that the November 22nd report that we have will be strictly focused on health and not health and corrections as previously indicated in that. So we are going to, the corrections audit will be moved to a later date. We'll determine that date. So just make note of that there is a change in the November 22nd report. The committee schedule will be updated soon to reflect that. So just keep note on that. So that's about it as far as committee business. So our next meeting date will be October the 11th. That will be an in-camera session with Department of Finance and Treasury Board. And please note that that meeting will be held at 1Gov at the committee room. They're not here. So if you show up here, you're going to be lonely. Other than that, I would thank everybody and make notice the meeting is adjourned.